Dr. Byrd is the Goodrich C. White Professor of American Studies in the Graduate Institute of Liberal Arts and the Department of African American Studies, and he's also the founding director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute for Advanced Interdisciplinary Studies, all at Emory University. He was educated at Lewis and Clark College and Yale University. His awards and fellowships include an Andrew Mellon Fellowship at Harvard and visiting scholar at the Bellagio Student and Conference Center. His newest project is the editing of the essential writings of James Weldon Johnson, the book which we have for sale this evening, and he'll be happy to sign it after tonight's program. Dr. Byrd's book will introduce one of the major figures of the Harlem literary renaissance to many readers, while for others it will serve as a reminder of why we celebrate Johnson today. Not only has the book been sensitively and thoughtfully edited, but it contains 2 short, previously unpublished plays, giving admirers of Johnson even more reasons to acquire the book. It also contains an introduction by the prize-winning novelist Charles Johnson, about whom Dr. Byrd has written a very fine critical study. It is only one of the directions our guest talents have taken him over the years. He also has been close friends with Alice Walker, and because of that, his connections to her have led Emory University to be able to acquire her valuable papers. Quite a coup for the university and for Atlanta. In addition, Dr. Byrd was the moving force behind the creation of the Atlanta Reads program and maintains close ties to Greater Atlanta's literary community. And finally, and importantly, he is currently at work on a biography of the author Ernest J. Gaines. Will you please join me in welcoming for this evening's lecture the distinguished literary scholar, Dr. Rudolph Byrd.
Good evening. Thank you, Bill, for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for coming out. There are lots of choices that you could have made this evening. Atlanta is a rich and interesting place in which to live, and I'm delighted that you've chosen to come and spend an evening to hear something about James Weldon Johnson. This talk, which is entitled A Poet and Statesman, James Weldon Johnson and the Early Years of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, is dedicated to 2 very important visitors who are here, to Ben and to Mariah. And they had lots of other options this evening, and I'm delighted that they've come out to hear someone who masquerades as their uncle from time to time. So this is for you. Early in the summer of 1916, I was in Jacksonville on a 3rd visit to my mother since I had moved to New York, writes James Weldon Johnson in his autobiography, Along This Way. While there, I received a letter from J.E. Spingarn inviting me to be a member of a conference on questions relating to the Negro, which would be attended by both white and colored people, and would be held at his country place, Troutbeck, at Armenia, New York. At the bottom of the letter, W.E.B. Du Bois had scribbled, "Do come." In this opening paragraph from a chapter in Along This Way, Johnson prepares the ground for his reflections upon his historic leadership of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, as we observe the centenary of the NAACP, the nation's oldest civil rights organization, that served as the foundation for the emergence of the modern civil rights movement. It is incumbent upon us to recall James Weldon Johnson's contributions as a leader of the association. My efforts to bring to publication the essential writings of James Weldon Johnson were motivated by the wish to commemorate the centenary of the NAACP, as well as Johnson's leadership during a critical period in the association's history. Johnson tells us that while visiting his mother, Helen Louise Dillette, in his native Jacksonville, Florida, that he receives a letter from J.E. Spingarn. The son of Austrian Jews, Joel Elias Spingarn, was born in New York City, a Harvard PhD. He was a member of the faculty of Columbia University, where he was a professor of comparative literature until he resigned in protest over the dismissal of a faculty colleague by the university's president. A botanist and expert on the clematis, Spingarn also was a 20th century abolitionist, fully committed to the abolition of the color line and all forms of discrimination based upon race. At the time of his letter to Johnson in 1916, he had already established the Spingarn Medal, an award still given annually by the NAACP for, quote, the highest and noblest achievement of an American Negro, unquote. And he was in his third year of a 6-year term as president of the board of the NAACP. Spingarn had become aware of Johnson chiefly through the very intelligent editorials he had written for the New York Age, since joining its editorial staff as a contributing editor in 1914. The invitation to attend the first of 2 interracial conferences on the state of U.S. race relations, now remembered as the Amenia Conferences, would be an opportunity for Spingarn and Johnson to meet for the first time. The postscript of Spingarn's letter was scribbled by none other than W.E.B. Du Bois, a graduate of Fisk University and the first African American to earn a Ph.D. from Harvard University. At the time of this communication to Johnson, Du Bois was the founding editor of The Crisis, a record of the darker race, the monthly magazine of the NAACP, established in 1910. Du Bois and Johnson had met in 1904 when Johnson had returned to Atlanta University, now Clark Atlanta University, to receive an honorary degree from his alma mater. When Du Bois joined Spingarn in inviting Johnson to Troutbeck, the NAACP was in its 6th year as the most radical civil rights organization in the nation. The organization had several different iterations: the Niagara Movement of 1905, the National Committee for the Advancement of the Negro in 1909, and finally the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1910. According to the historian David Levering Lewis, quote, colored was chosen instead of Afro-American or Negro in order to proclaim the association's intention to promote the interests of dark-skinned people everywhere, unquote. The outcome of 2 national Negro conventions presided over by Du Bois and Oswald Garrison Villard, the journalist and grandson of the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, the NAACP stood in opposition to the accommodationist policies of Booker T. Washington and his powerful Tuskegee machine. The first president of the NAACP was Moorfield Story, past president of the American Bar Association and personal secretary to the abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts. Of Story, David Levering Lewis writes, quote, judicious, principled, possessing enormous, if waning, influence in national circles of power, the white-maned Brahmin was the perfect choice to head an organization for which no black person, however distinguished, could be considered in 1910, unquote. While Du Bois provided the vision and much of the fire of the NAACP, even after its formal creation on May 14, 1910, there was no position, salaried or otherwise, for the author of Mr. Booker T. Washington and others. Nearly a month would pass before a formal offer would be made to Du Bois by William English Walling, one of the new association's organizers. The offer came in the form of Director of Publicity and Research, from which position Du Bois joined Spingarn in inviting Johnson to Troutbeck. This is part of the history that stands behind the letter of invitation to Johnson from Spingarn and Du Bois to attend the first Amenia Conference in 1916. Added to this history is the history of Johnson's ties to Booker T. Washington. Johnson had been treasurer and later president of the Colored Republican Club of New York City, a club in which Booker rights held sway. With his brother Rosamond, James had written Theodore Roosevelt's 1904 campaign song, You're All Right, Teddy. With the blessings of Washington, a grateful Roosevelt appointed Johnson U.S. Consul General to Venezuela and Nicaragua for the period 1906 to 1913. A cosmopolite who was fluent in Spanish, Johnson was well prepared for these appointments and was the first African American to rise to this level of responsibility in the U.S. Department of State. In 1912, Consul Johnson had strapped a .45 to his belt and superintended the defense of Nicaragua's main port city, Corentino, against attack until the arrival of U.S. Marines ended a rebellion against a pro-American president. At the end of his tour of duty in Central and South America, the Tuskegee machine was instrumental in engineering Johnson's appointment as contributing editor to the New York Age. Spingarn and Du Bois had some misgivings about Johnson because of his ties to Washington, and these had not been assuaged even after the death of the wizard in 1915. Nevertheless, the president of the board of the NAACP and the editor of The Crisis decided to take their chances with the poet of 50 years, a poem Johnson wrote to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Published in the New York Times on January 1st, 1913, Johnson recalls that on the following day, quote, the Times printed a fairly long and quite laudatory editorial comment on the poem, unquote. The poem was praised by Theodore Roosevelt, Booker T. Washington, the novelist Charles Chesnutt, and Du Bois. Johnson accepted the invitation to attend the Amenia Conference. When he arrived there on August 24th, 1916, he discovered that Du Bois was his tent mate. David Levering Lewis writes that, quote, the editor's apprehensions about Johnson's Tuskegee connections had been so well assuaged that the two of them speculated about forming a secret organization to energize the civil rights elements represented at the conference. Johnson's gracious informality and infinite tact had impressed both Du Bois and Spingarn, unquote. The editor and the president also were impressed by Johnson's speech delivered at the Amenia Conference, a working program for the future. Spingarn wrote to Johnson again in the fall of 1916 to offer him a position in the association. Johnson recalled that, quote, the offer was a genuine surprise. I had not received the slightest intimation of its likelihood. Nevertheless, under my surprise, I was aware that what had come to me was in the line of destiny. When I received Mr. Spingarn's letter, it at once seemed to me that every bit of experience I had had, from the principalship of Stanton School to editorship on the New York Age, was preparation for the work I was being asked to undertake, unquote. To this abbreviated list of professional accomplishments, Johnson could have added his 7 years of experience as a Foreign Service officer who often found himself seeking the harmonious resolution of conflict under fire. Without question, the variety of Johnson's administrative and diplomatic experiences would help him to negotiate not only the association's complex racial politics, but also those dividing the nation as well. The board of directors, writes Johnson, created the position of field secretary, and in that capacity I began work with the association in December 1916. With a suite of offices directly across the hall from those occupied by Du Bois and his staff of the Crisis, Johnson was the association's first field secretary. In accepting this appointment, he and Du Bois were the only African Americans who held salary positions of some importance at the association. With the exception of Du Bois, the association's board was entirely white. According to historian David Levering Lewis, quote, The first African-American staff was as white as the officers, except for Augustus Dill, a former student of Du Bois from Atlanta University, and one or two others, unquote. During a brief visit to the association's offices at 75th Avenue, the very color-conscious Marcus Garvey deplored the racial formations among the staff. The appointment of the handsome, bronze-colored, gray-eyed Johnson represented progress on the part of the board to provide leadership positions for African Americans. The central purpose of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, writes the association's first field secretary, was nothing more nor less than to claim for the Negro common equality under the fundamental law of the United States, to insist upon the impartial application of that law, to proclaim that democracy stultified itself when it barred men from its benefits solely on the grounds of race and color, unquote. The association's insistence upon the, quote, impartial applications, unquote, of law in 1916 constituted a considerable challenge to the status quo. The 1896 Supreme Court ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson, which justified separate but equal in public transportation, was quickly becoming institutionalized in all phases of American life. The administration of President Woodrow Wilson would extend segregation to all branches of the federal government. And so, when the association announced its platform of equality for the Negro, recalls Johnson, a great many people were startled. Such a platform, as it was to be expected, aroused fierce antagonisms to the organization. It was denounced as radical, revolutionary, subversive, and those at its head were branded as dangerous busybodies or idealistic fanatics, unquote. Notwithstanding the strong winds of opposition, Johnson writes that I threw myself wholeheartedly into this work. As field secretary, Johnson's first priority was to increase the number of the association's branches in the South. At the time of his appointment in 1916, there were 68 branches in northern and western cities, and only 3 branches in the South, New Orleans and Shreveport, Louisiana, and Key West, Florida. Some board members did not support Johnson's goal to increase the number of branches in the South, as they felt the existence of such branches might force the association to modify its position. Johnson believed otherwise. It was my deep conviction, remembers the field secretary, that the aims of the association could never be realized by only hammering at white America. I felt convinced that it would be necessary to awaken black America, awaken it to a sense of its rights and to a determination to hold fast to such as it possessed and to seek in every orderly way possible to secure all others to which it was entitled, unquote. Johnson's argument prevailed. The board authorized the field secretary to develop a strategy to extend the association's reach into the South. In 3 years' time, Johnson's strategy yielded what the association proudly called its, quote, Southern Empire, unquote. At the close of 1919, writes Johnson, there were 310 branches in the association, 131 of them being in the South. Through Johnson's leadership, the association had become a national power. The field secretary's successful Southern strategy necessitated the hiring of additional staff. He was presented with such an opportunity while attending an association conference in Atlanta in the fall of 1917. Johnson remembers this conference as, quote, unique, unquote, for 2 reasons. As he recalls, it was the only one in which no woman was invited to take part. There were present 50 or so of the leading colored men of the city, but not a single woman. Like Frederick Douglass and Du Bois, Johnson was an advocate for women's rights. He supported the 19th Amendment to the Constitution long before it was adopted in 1920. The field secretary also remembers the Atlanta conference as unique because of the impressive work of the conference's secretary. I did not need to guess that the representative conference and the extraordinary mass meeting were largely the results of his efforts. I left Atlanta, mused Johnson, having made a strong mental note about him. The secretary of the association's Atlanta conference was Walter White. A native of Atlanta, White was an alumnus of Atlanta University and a member of First Congregational Church, where he worshiped with Alonzo Herndon, one of a group of 50 men who had gathered at Niagara Falls in 1905 to prepare the foundation for what would become the NAACP. Physically white but racially mixed, White self-identified as black. During the Atlanta riot of 1906, he and his father armed themselves against a mob that threatened to destroy their home. While Johnson was interested in inviting White to join the staff of the NAACP, certain members of the association's board expressed doubts about the qualifications of someone so young, unknown, and from the South. Now, as the acting secretary who had made the association a national power through a successful Southern strategy, Johnson continued to press his case. Here again he prevailed in the argument. Walter White joined the national office in 1918 as assistant secretary. He would particularly distinguish himself in the association's investigations of lynchings. Unbeknown to him at the time, in recruiting White, Johnson also had addressed the important and future question of succession. White would succeed Johnson as secretary of the association following his retirement in 1931. Along with creating a national network of NAACP branches and recruiting new and dynamic leadership, Johnson also focused the attention and resources of the association upon the national crime and shame of lynching. The field secretary's interest in lynching was not abstract. In 1901, he came close to being lynched himself by a group of militiamen in a Jacksonville park. As a consequence of this experience, lynching would emerge as an important theme in Johnson's The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, a novel he published anonymously in 1912. After witnessing a lynching, the narrator makes the decision to pass for white. He makes this fateful decision not out of fear, but rather shame at, quote, being identified with a people that could with impunity be treated worse than animals, unquote. As field secretary, Johnson routinely investigated lynchings. In 1918, he investigated the lynching of Mary Turner in Quitman, Georgia, a particularly brutal lynching given fictional significance by Jean Toomer in Kane, his landmark work of fiction, poetry, and drama. In that same year, Johnson notes in his autobiography that the association published 30 Years of Lynching, an early study of lynching and racial violence produced by John R. Shilladay, a white social worker who served as secretary of the NAACP from 1918 to 1920. In 1919, Johnson took, quote, the first steps for the association towards securing the enactment of a federal law against lynching, unquote. For 2 years, Johnson galvanized national support for the Dyer anti-lynching bill. While the bill failed to become law because of insufficient votes in the Senate, Johnson believed that agitation, quote, for the passage of the measure was without doubt one of the prime factors in reducing the number of lynchings. It also served to awaken the people of the southern states to the necessity of taking steps themselves to wipe out the crime. And this, I think, was its most far-reaching result. How am I doing, Ben and Mariah? Okay? All right. In 1917, Johnson organized one of the association's most famous public demonstrations against lynching and racial violence. He spearheaded the Silent March of July 1917, to denounce the loss of black life in the East St. Louis massacre, a riot in which, as he writes, quote, nearly 6,000 Negroes were driven from their homes, hundreds of them killed, some burned in the houses, set fire over their heads, unquote. In collaboration with the leadership of churches and other black institutions, the field secretary organized a mass demonstration that served as the blueprint for others sponsored by the association in decades to come. On Saturday, July 28th, 9,000 or 10,000 Negroes marched silently down Fifth Avenue to the sound only of muffled drums. The procession was headed by children, some of them not older than 6, dressed in white. These were followed by the women dressed in white, and bringing up the rear came the men in dark clothes. They carried banners, some of which read, "Mother, do lynchers go to heaven?" The streets of New York, observed Johnson, have witnessed many strange sights, but I judge never one stranger than this, certainly never one more impressive. In the weeks that followed the silent march of July 1917, Johnson organized a national campaign to denounce the execution of 13 black servicemen of the 24th Infantry charged with rioting and murder in Houston, Texas on August 23, 1917. The so-called Houston affair revealed the complex, paradoxical position of African Americans in relation to the national government during a time of war. Why fight for democracy abroad when denied democracy at home? Johnson led the delegation of African American leaders who met then with President Woodrow Wilson to request a federal investigation of this incident. Johnson's assessment of Wilson following the White House meeting was not favorable. Quote, "I could not rid myself of the conviction that at bottom there was something hypocritical about him," unquote. Johnson noted that, quote, "Wilson commuted the sentences of 10 servicemen to life imprisonment and affirmed the death sentences of 6. He also did make a strong utterance against mob violence and lynching," unquote. Looking back upon the Houston affair several years later, Johnson wrote in a parenthetical statement in his autobiography, quote, "So it may be that my estimate of Mr. Wilson was actually colored and twisted by prejudice," unquote. In 1920, the board appointed Johnson secretary or chief executive officer, thus making him the first African American to hold this position within the NAACP. As secretary of the association from 1920 until his retirement in 1931, he continued to agitate for the civil rights of African Americans. Honoring the global diasporic mission of the association, Johnson provided national leadership in the investigation of the U.S. occupation of Haiti in 1915. Regarding Johnson's tenure as secretary of the NAACP, the historian David Levering Lewis provides this assessment, quote, "He was a superb public speaker and an even better arbitrator and politician. His was the NAACP voice besides Joel Spingarn's, to which Du Bois usually listened with respect. Colleagues called Johnson wise, philosophical, cosmopolitan, and possessed of sweet reasonableness, all of which was true. By the mid-20s, he was recognized within the race and without as Afro-America's senior statesman," unquote. As Afro-America's senior statesman, the secretary believed in the acquisition of civil rights for African Americans, not only by agitation, demonstrations, and legal challenges, but he also believed in the uses of art and culture as powerful weapons in the national struggle for civil rights, or civil rights by copyright, to recall a witticism by David Levering Lewis. In his preface to the Book of American Negro Poetry, published in 1921, Johnson makes the claim that, quote, "The final measure of the greatness of all peoples is the amount and standard of the literature and art they have produced. And nothing will do more to change the mental attitude and raise his status than a demonstration of intellectual parity by the Negro through the production of literature and art, unquote. 7 years later, in his essay, Race, Prejudice, and the Negro Artist, the Secretary expressed his unwavering optimism in the power of art and culture to ameliorate relations between the races. Quote, "For many years and by many methods, the Negro has been overcoming the coarser prejudices against him. And when we consider how many of the subtler prejudices have crumbled, and crumbled rapidly under the process of art creation by the Negro, we are justified in taking a hopeful outlook toward the effect that the increase of recognized individual artists, 5-fold, 10-fold, 20-fold, will have on this most perplexing and vital question before the American people," unquote. Johnson worked to overcome the coarser prejudices through the promotion of the artistic and literary production of African American artists and through his own considerable artistic achievements. Along with Du Bois, the sociologist Charles Johnson, and the philosopher Alain Locke, Johnson is a member of an older generation of writers who supported and advanced the work of a younger generation of writers and artists associated with the Harlem Renaissance, or the New Negro movement. The younger generation of writers include such figures as Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Countee Cullen, Jessie Fawcett, Jean Toomer, Sterling Brown, and many others. Johnson published the poetry of these younger writers in his Book of American Negro Poetry, published in 1921 and revised and enlarged a decade later. It is the first anthology of African American poetry in English published in the U.S. Johnson was also one of the architects of the now legendary Civic Club dinner of 1924. Many scholars regard this awards dinner, which took place at New York's Civic Club, as the dress rehearsal for the Harlem Renaissance. Along with Du Bois, Johnson was a charter member of the Civic Club, and with his colleague from the NAACP, he shared in the hosting of an event that constituted one of the high points of the Harlem Renaissance that spans the period 1917 to 1936. Johnson produced an impressive body of work in literature and music. As a composer, novelist, dramatist, editor, essayist, and poet, he produced a number of works that possess canonical status in the African American tradition of arts and letters. In 1900, Johnson, together with his younger brother, J. Rosamond Johnson, composed Lift Every Voice and Sing. This hymn was composed for a program sponsored by the black leadership of Jacksonville to celebrate the birthday of Abraham Lincoln. At the time of its composition, Johnson was the principal at Stanton School, his alma mater. The elder Johnson wrote the words of the hymn, and the younger Johnson, as his older brother remembers, quote, created the noble setting of the poem, unquote. In subsequent years, the hymn was adopted by the NAACP, and for generations it has been sung as, quote, the Negro national anthem. While the Johnson brothers considered Lift Every Voice and Sing, quote, an incidental effort, an effort made under stress and with no intention other than to meet the needs of a particular moment, unquote, it has easily eclipsed in popularity and importance their earlier compositions. As James Weldon Johnson would observe more than 3 decades after the hymn's composition, quote, we wrote better than we knew, unquote. The autobiography of an ex-colored man is one of Johnson's most celebrated works, completed during his tenure as Consul General in Nicaragua. Published anonymously in 1912, Johnson revealed himself as the author in the 1927 edition of the novel. This experimental novel that masquerades as autobiography deftly explores the phenomenon of passing while creating a fascinating portrait of New York's black bohemia and giving fictional significance to Du Bois's theory of black psychology, or double consciousness. Johnson's pioneering treatment of the mulatto would influence the depiction of this figure by the writers of the Harlem Renaissance, as well as such contemporary writers as Charles Johnson. As a poet, Johnson experimented with standard and dialect verse, and in both genres produced poetry of enduring beauty and force. His master poem, 50 Years, published in 1913 to mark the 50th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, is one of the novelist commemorative poems in the English language. Johnson's poems in dialect are no less praiseworthy. With the publication in 1927 of God's Trombones, he captured for all time the majesties of black folk speech, while also honoring the almost mythic oratorical powers of the black folk preacher. Of the 7 folk sermons that comprise God's Trombones, perhaps the most celebrated is The Creation. The agnostic secretary of the association wrote this folk sermon in 1919 after hearing a black preacher address a congregation in Kansas City. Johnson was impressed by the delivery and performance of this unnamed black preacher who, as he recalled in his autobiography Along This Way, quote, excited my envy, unquote, through his mastery of language and the occasion, and who, as a consequence, stirred, quote, something primordial in me, unquote. For you, I have brought a recording of Johnson reading The Creation. Would you play it, please? That was a beautiful rendering of what some call salvation history. And I suspect that there are many here who probably grew up delivering the creation and other poems from God's trombones and oratorical contests at schools, churches, community centers, and African American communities. And that's still a wonderful tradition in African American communities. And it started with Johnson's creation, honoring of the black folk preacher. Published to great critical acclaim in 1933, Johnson's autobiography, Along This Way, is the portrait of a self-described race man and cosmopolite, of a poet, and also of an unafraid leader of his race. When Along This Way was published, Johnson was 62 years old, and at the height of his national and international power and influence, which he wore lightly and with considerable dignity. The publication of Johnson's autobiography was heralded as a landmark event by both blacks and whites, as is evident in the uniformly positive response to the volume. The poet County Cullen wrote to Johnson to observe that the autobiography, quote, is a fine and enviable road to have traveled, and you have described it in masterly fashion, unquote. The novelist and anthropologist Zora Neale Hurston, who in her correspondence with Johnson addressed him affectionately as Lord Jim, praised his autobiography. Quote, I am reading Along This Way now. It is grand, unquote. Joel E. Spingarn, Johnson's fellow freedom fighter within the framework of the NAACP, provided an assessment of the autobiography that reveals the depth of their long friendship. Quote, it is a noble book, dear Jim, this record of your life. Always you seem to see visions and yet have your feet on the ground, to combine imagination and common sense as only one who is both poet and statesman could. I congratulate you from my heart, unquote. As one of the pillars in the temple of culture remembered as the Harlem Renaissance, Johnson supported and nurtured many writers, including the poet Langston Hughes. Hughes, who telegraphed his enthusiasm for Along This Way, writes, greetings and congratulations on putting into living words a life so well lived. Bravo, encore, and a second volume after you have lived a lot more along this way, unquote. Johnson's political writings are no less compelling than his writings in other genres. His last and most substantial analysis of the barriers to full citizenship for African Americans is Negro Americans, What Now? Published in 1934, 3 years after his historic term as executive secretary of the NAACP, in this treatise, Johnson writes, quote, directly to my fellow Negro Americans on the American question, which most deeply affects us, unquote. In contemplating the barriers to full citizenship for African Americans, Johnson's objective is not to, quote, formulate a complete and practicable program, unquote, but rather, quote, to lay down certain lines along which a program may be worked out, unquote. For Johnson, the contradictions of American democracy are not solely the problem of African Americans, but rather they are set forth as a national crisis requiring a national solution. While on the surface a man of seemingly competing discrete parts, in actuality Johnson achieved a rare and complex synthesis in his life. What emerges from this synthesis is a humane and Catholic view of the world and of the human condition that Johnson termed cosmopolitanism. Speaking of what is required of us if we are to transcend race and the other forms of difference that have divided us as a nation, in Negro Americans, What Now? He asserts that, quote, the accomplishment at once demands on both sides a considerable cosmopolitanism of spirit and intellect. It is easy to live within the strict limits of one's own group. One knows its language. its language of words and ideas. One knows all the questions that will come up and the answers. One does not have to extend himself. Social and intellectual intercourse, observes Johnson, on even the outskirts of cosmopolitanism is a more strenuous matter. And that is one of the reasons why human beings prefer parochialism, unquote. Without question, Johnson's enduring significance and relevance as artist, freedom fighter, and humanitarian are grounded in his rejection of parochialism and the several ways in which he embodied a, quote, considerable cosmopolitanism of spirit and intellect. It is this hybrid, just, egalitarian vision of the world in which nothing is alien, in which all the cultures of the world constitute our shared inheritance, and in which we all are valued, that is everywhere in evidence, in his life, and in the pages of the essential writings of James Weldon Johnson. Thank you for your attention. Well, Ben, did I do all right? Did I do okay? All right. Before the book signing, I'm happy to respond to one or two questions or comments. You've been very patient with me. I went on for far too long, I suspect. Yes, sir.
In your studies, did you find any videos? I see some more video clips now becoming available. They find these archives. Any videos of Johnson?
Yes, there is some moving footage, but not with Johnson speaking. And that material can be found in the James Weldon Johnson Memorial Collection of Negro Arts and Letters at Yale University. It was a collection established in 1948 by his friend Carl Van Vechten out of memory of their friendship. And it is regarded as one of the most important archival collections in the nation, focusing upon African American literature and culture. We are assembling a rival collection at Emory. I think we're doing a good job. Yes, Ben. How many days did it take me to put that book together? How many days in a year? 365, and a little more than that. A little more than that. I had been thinking about this for about 2 years, and then I sat down one day and plotted out a course of work. So it took about a year. And then I was helped in completing the book with a residency at the Bellagio Study and Conference Center. I spent 4 weeks there and completed much of the writing there. It's impossible not to get work done in such a lovely setting. Yes?
Given that you marvel at the magnitude of his work, how much he produced?
Yes, Johnson, the volume that I produced is called The Essential Writings, and so the objective there is to function as a kind of teaser to get you directed towards the very large corpus that he produced over, oh my goodness, at least a 35-year period. The volume contains the complete text of his novel, The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man. Indeed, all of the works that I referenced in my talk, with the exception of the preface to the Book of American Negro Poetry, are published, are reprinted in this collection. He was I marvel at the level of discipline. He wrote while he also worked as, and this is one of the points that I was trying to make in the talk, from the point of his first appointment as field secretary at the NAACP in 1916 to his retirement in 1931, he produced 2-3 volumes of poems, He reprinted, with a new introduction, his novel, The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man. He edited the first anthology of African American poetry, the Book of American Negro Poetry, which interestingly is a project that that was supported by his friend and colleague Joel Spingarn. The volume was published by Harcourt, Brace, and Jovanovich, HBJ, which is a major publishing house. It was started in 1918, and Spingarn contributed $50,000 to get it going. And so he mentioned this to Johnson in passing and asked him if he had anything that could be published, and Johnson provided him with this anthology. And the Spingarns continued to be associated with Harcourt, Brace, and Jovanovich until about 1984, and then they sold their rights to it. And one of the most celebrated authors associated with this publishing house is Alice Walker. 90% of the work that she's published has been published by that publishing house. But Johnson is a great example of discipline. I try to model that as best I can. It is amazing to me how he would go out and lead something like the 1917 March, and then go back to his study and write a poem or write an essay or anything else that he felt inspired to write. He felt that he had to be productive as a literary artist because it was, as I mentioned in the talk, part of his belief that that arts and culture constituted an important means of ameliorating race relations. And rather than simply proclaim that, he felt it was his responsibility also to live that creed. And he did so, I think, very productively. And his works are canonical texts that continue to be taught to this day, especially his novel, The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, which I'll be teaching next semester, or this semester. It started, right? I've been on leave, and so I need to catch up. It'll be the first text I'll have the pleasure of teaching in my survey course on 20th century African American literature. Oh my, all right. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes. I don't. You'd have to ask his wife, Grace Nail, about that. But I think that he did, based upon his own writings and the biography about the biography of his life, and everything I've gleaned from letters, correspondence. He rose up very early in the morning, went to his NAACP office, and worked until 4, went home and had dinner, and went to the theater, to an opening. Remember, this is the 1920s, this is the Harlem Renaissance. There's something to do every night, and he's at the center of it. And then after his retirement from the NAACP in 1931, he began a teaching career. He taught at Fisk University. He was the Adam K. Spence Professor of Creative Writing at Fisk for 2 years. And then he was the first African American to teach at New York University in the English department. He taught there 1935 to 1936. And he was productive and had a rich family life. He was completely in love with his wife, Grace Nail. And they didn't have children. That might be one reason why he was so productive. But he had a rich life. This way. Yes, sir. Pardon? The last lynching in the country, it depends upon how you would define that. It could have happened as recently as last week in Oakland. You've read about the Byrd murder in Oakland. I'm from Longview, Texas, and so there's the case of Byrd, no family connection, who was lynched in 1991. So It's difficult to know, depending upon how you define racial violence. But I would certainly define what occurred last week in Oakland as an instance of racial violence. Yes, sir.
I was going to ask, given his embracing of multiculturalism,
Yes.
how did his relationship end up with W. Du Bois?
Well, at the time, during the 30s, they were very much on the same page. Johnson died in 1938 in a car accident, very tragically. He was on vacation in Maine, and his wife, Grace, was driving. Johnson didn't drive. She drove, and while she drove, he wrote speeches and other things. But sadly, he died in 1938, and so at that point, he and Du Bois believed very much in the goals of the NAACP. They shared that vision. They also shared the vision of a country that would honor its constitutional promises and obligations to African Americans, to women and other people of color, other disenfranchised groups. It was later in Du Bois's life, in the 1940s and 50s, that he became disenchanted with the United States, and as you know, he immigrated to Ghana at the invitation of President Kwame Nkrumah and became a citizen of Ghana in 1961. And he died there and is resting there. And so given Du Bois's long struggle, it's rather sobering to think about the decisions he made at the end of his life. But I think those decisions, based upon his experience, are justified. But at the time of their long friendship, and up until Johnson's death, there was much agreement between Du Bois and Johnson in terms of their strategies for improving the political and social and economic condition of African Americans. My colleague from Spelman College, hello. Yes.
I'm just curious where that was held. It was an interracial conference. Where did they meet?
It wasn't an interracial conference. No, it was an association conference. And according to Johnson, what was distinctive about it was the absence of black women, but there were 50 black men there. And it isn't clear from Johnson's notes where this took place, but I surmise that it took place on Auburn Avenue at the theater on Auburn Avenue, which was dedicated to Booker T. Washington around 1909, 1910. It's that two-story Gothic building on Auburn Avenue, and right now, directly across the street from it is a small police station. And the building has been renovated. But I suspect that that was the building because it was an important meeting place for African Americans during that time. It was prized as an important example of black achievement during that particular time. And its proximity to Auburn Avenue, which was described by John Wesley Dobbs as Sweet Auburn, as the center for black business life, black cultural life. So I suspect that that's the building, but that's a surmise. Johnson doesn't state exactly where it took place.